So in our last chapter for muscles, we're going to talk about how muscles actually get the signal to move, and then basically what gives it their strength, and then we're going to talk about muscle waves. So before we even get there, there's something called a muscle unit, and a muscle unit is something that controls basically strength of how much you're going to hold something. So imagine you didn't know the strength of, let's say, or the weight of a book, and you grab that book and you first gave it a little bit of oomph and you found out it was still too heavy. What would happen is you'd start to recruit more and more and more muscles to actually eventually pick that up. And that oomph is basically motor units. So if you thought the book was going to be really light, you'd only recruit a couple of motor units. But then as you realized that the book weighed a lot, you were going to recruit even more, and that was going to give you the ability to pick up that book. So you're kind of gauging things, how you're going to pick it up. Is it heavy? Is it light? Stimulation is basically multiple quick nerve impulses that make the contraction happen even more. So is that going to be you moving your muscles just a little bit? Or is it going to be a complete pull of that muscle going from one area to another? And that's going to be called length-tension relationship. We're going to talk about that in the relationship to different waves. So before we even get there, let's just make sure we have motor unit down and really talk about how the motor unit affects the muscle fiber itself. So motor unit is basically one nerve cell, and basically it touches a muscle fiber. And this is going to send a little energy down to either use one muscle, or is it going to use all of these guys to recruit it? Of course, if you use just one, we're going to have a little bit of energy, but if we use all the muscle fibers, we're going to be able to give it a little more strength and be able to pick up heavier objects. So motor unit, one nerve cell that affects to a muscle unit. The effective muscle will go ahead and contract when it gets that energy. Remember from our last chapter where we go ahead and give it a little bit of electrical energy, which will get the calcium inside, and that'll get our acetylcholine in, and that'll start the process of being able to get into the muscle and tell the muscle to move. But a motor unit can stimulate one or more muscle fiber, and that's again because one motor unit could go to one muscle, or it could go to a couple muscles at the same time and be able to contract them all at the same time, or just go ahead and have only one of those units go ahead and get controlled. So with something like your eyelid or your fingertips, you're going to have a lot more fine sort of feel. So you're going to have less motor units to work with, but where your biceps and triceps and quads, you're going to have a lot more motor units, basically helping you push or run or do whatever you need. An example would be you have a muscle that has 25 fibers. A single neuron can activate 5 muscle fibers at a time, so that means there's 5 motor units there. And it could stimulate one of them, it could stimulate all 5 of them. It really depends on the strength of what it's really picking up. Please don't get from this video, this little slide, that we're going to have some math on this next test. There totally won't be. But let's talk about how a motor unit can go ahead and get more stimuli to increase strength. So recruitment is more than one motor unit stimulated simultaneously. So one of them realized it wasn't enough, so they're going to use a couple of them at the time to go ahead and pick things up. A small muscle will require sort of precise movements, so like think about your fingertips, your eyelids, and things like that. Single neurons affecting single muscles. Large muscles, triceps, biceps, quads, they're going to require more brute strength, so they're going to have larger muscle units. So more of them will get stimulated at the same time to do a single action. And this action is going to be called a muscle twitch. A muscle twitch is a muscle that's been affected by some response to do something. So a stimulus must reach the muscle to tell it to do something, and then we're going to have these periods of action, contraction, and then relax. And let's go through that process. So when we have a muscle twitch, a few things happen. The first thing is that latent period occurs, and that's the time between the onset of the contraction, and this is when the T-tubules are being depolarized with the calcium, and it's starting to move the muscles. You start to get them to bind onto the actin and the thick heads and the thin heads. The contraction is going to be the sarcomeres get shorter. Remember how we have that muscle action start to squeeze in? And then relaxation is basically calcium is pushed back, and we then go ahead and get the signal to go away. Even the acetylcholine esterase, that enzyme comes and gobbles up all the acetylcholine to make sure that we're going back to relaxation. So let's look at these as waves, and let's even sort of think about what the thick and thin filaments are doing for each of these. So with the latency one, I apologize for this slide being so crazy, but I think this will start to get you into what each of these waves are. So with the latent period, this is going to be where we're going to start to get that signal. So this is the time between the stimulation of the action. The sarcolemma and the T-tubules begin to depolarize, and then calcium is released into the cytoplasm, and then the myosin, the thick heads and the thin heads, start to get some sort of reaction. So that's what that latent period is. We're just getting the reaction to go ahead and start, and those myosin heads are going to start to attach to the thin filaments and start to do a movement. Contraction is those sarcomeres shorten. Of course, you can see that the myosin heads have crawled. We're in this part of the wave. So latent was right here before anything happened. Latent is going to be this next part of the wave. And as you can guess, relaxation is going to be this last part of the wave. This is where the calcium is actively transported back into the terminal. And then the myosins start to unbind from the actin, and that's why we go back to our normal relaxed mode. So basically what's happening is this wave is talking about before any of that electrical energy, the calcium and the sodium start to really react. All of a sudden the muscle starts to get the reaction of the sodium and the calcium, and it starts to contract. And then down here, this is what you're seeing here, is basically the thin and thick filaments start to relax and eventually go back to its normal state. These stimulations happen in different waves, and it basically happens by multiple stimuli. That occurs prior to complex relaxation. And you can keep adding these over and over and over again. If you think back to those myosin heads crawling on the thick and thin filaments, we need to know, are we just going for a small, maybe 2 of those myosin heads going on the thin filaments? Or are we going to have all of them go? So we're going to have constant contraction, contraction, contraction. And that's what this multiple stimulus is talking about. We can control this with more calcium is released by another stimulus before the calcium from the previous release is transported back. So we're just going to add more, add more, add more. And what the calcium is basically going to do is, remember that tropomyosin gets shifted, that filament, and that's going to create way more active cross bridges. And the more cross bridges you create, the more you're going to push those muscles together. So you're going to squeeze a little bit of that, the cross bridges, you're going to have barely a little bit of muscle movement, but the more those active myosins sort of crawl on each other, we're going to go ahead and start to crawl those thin and thick filaments together, and that's going to be called complete tetanus. That's stimulation in rapid succession, and it results in smooth, continuous reactions of muscles without relaxation between the stimuli. So this is like you extending your arm out. If you were to go ahead and raise your arm to your head just a little bit, you'd be doing some sort of minor stimuli, so multiple stimuli, to get it to maybe, let's say, to a 90-degree angle. But now let's say that you want to go ahead and take your hand and go ahead and touch your nose. that's going to be a complete stimuli of that muscle, so we call it complete tetanus. So remember back to that wave, if we just had one quick muscle movement, not too much of those myosin heads touching that thin and thick filament, we're going to have something like this. If we're going to move our arm to like a 90-degree sort of reaction, we're going to be pumping and pumping calcium until we're going to move those tropomyosins and create a lot more active bridges. And that's what you're seeing here. And this is going to be complete tetanus. This is you moving your arm that was extended all the way to touching your nose or your chin, so your muscle is completely pulled together. And those myosin heads have created a cross bridge with the thin filament and have crawled on them. So if we just think about now what the myosin heads and thick and thin filament are doing during this tension, this will make, I think, a little more sense. So tension is the strength of the contraction. So the more you contract your thick and thin filament, the more tension you have. And the less tension you have, you might only have one or two, let's imagine one or two of these thin filaments sort of touching. So we can have ability of doing complete tension, maybe sort of incomplete tension, and then relaxation, where the thick and thin filaments aren't touching at all. So this would be something like your thick and thin filaments touching your chin when you did the complete stretch. Over here, this would be where your arm is completely extended out. So your thick and thin filaments, at least for your biceps, are completely extended. And then finally, this is your resting state, where some of your filaments are touching thick and thin, but it's sort of in its relaxation mode.